Okay, so I haven't done one of these in a while. I want to talk today about a retro gaming system. Yep, I've done a few of these in the past where I kind of review and look over, talk about the history of a specific system. And the one I want to talk about today is the one that I came across basically that started me on gaming. It wasn't my first system. My first system was an Amstrad, but the one that started really me getting into gaming a little bit more until I get annoyed with other systems later on. But the one that actually got me into gaming and got me even thinking about wanting to come back was the Nintendo Entertainment System, or the NES. Now, when people generally talk about the Nintendo Entertainment System, it's talked about from one very specific viewpoint, that of North America, and occasionally from its Japanese roots, meaning that it is seen as being the game changer across the boards. Nothing else was there. But of course, this isn't right. This depends very specifically on where you were. Its impact on the market in Japan was transformative. Absolutely. It changed the game. In North America, it stabilized a damaged market. But in the UK and Europe, it simply existed alongside an already thriving home computer culture. We need to understand this to then properly look into it. Nintendo didn't start, of course, as a video games company. Most people will now know this, but maybe don't know just how old the company truly is. It didn't suddenly sprout up in the 1980s. It was founded in Kyoto in 1889. It made Hanafuda playing cards. Over decades, it moved into toys, mechanical amusements, and eventually electronic arcade games. Then, by 1981, came Donkey Kong. Designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, it became an international hit. And that success is what gave Nintendo the confidence to make a home console. Then, in July 1983, Nintendo released the Family Computer, or Famicom in Japan. There was a brief recall for faulty chips, but that was corrected quickly and it sold rapidly. It became the dominant home console in Japan. The system used an 8-bit Rico processor derived from the MOS 6502 with limited memory and graphics. Developers could rely on predictable hardware behavior, and many cartridges included extra chips to expand the system's capabilities. When Nintendo moved outside of Japan, conditions were very different. North America had experienced the 1983 video game crash. The market was flooded with low-quality games. Consumer trust had collapsed and retailers were wary. In this context, Nintendo introduced the NES, with strict licensing rules and a lockout chip that prevented unlicensed games. Historians widely agree this helped stabilize the North American console market, though this effect was of course regional. Europe was a completely different game altogether. Home computers dominated. The ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, Amstrad CPC, and later the Amiga were widely used. Gaming culture was closely tied to programming, the cassettes, and magazines. Within this, the NES was popular with children and households that wanted a ready-to-play console. But it didn't replace computers or become dominant in the way that we saw in Japan, or even a stabilizing force, as there was no need for it, as we saw in North America. The NES was where software quality became critical. Super Mario Bros., released in 1985, had precise controls, smooth scrolling, and levels that rewarded skill and exploration. Its influence on platform games is well documented, though how quickly it became iconic varied by region. The Legend of Zelda introduced battery-backed saving, allowing long, persistent play. Metroid encouraged non-linear exploration. Final Fantasy launched in Japan on the NES in 1987 before being localized elsewhere. Nintendo controlled third-party development tightly. Developers could release only a limited number of games per year, and Nintendo controlled cartridge production. In North America, this is widely credited with improving quality control. In the UK, it clashed with a culture used to tinkering and informal distribution on home computers. This is a very big difference. The NES controller also mattered. Its D-pad replaced bulky joysticks and became the basis for nearly all future consoles. This is a demonstrable hardware history. Its simplicity, consistency, and comfort helped make NES games accessible to a broad audience. But that effect was still mediated by local gaming culture and hardware adoption. Globally, the NES and Famicom sold just over 60 million units. Japan had the Famicom as a cultural fixture. North America experienced a console market revival, and the UK and much of Europe saw coexistence between consoles and home computers rather than outright displacement. The NES didn't disappear when the Super Nintendo arrived. Its games continue to be played, reissued, and studied. Many modern developers reference NES-era design principles, particularly in independent game development. But its influence was not identical everywhere. What the NES represented depended on the market, dominance in Japan, recovery in North America, and parallel adoption in the UK and Europe. Hardware limitations drove creativity. Developers had to work with small memory, limited graphics, and limited sound channels. Techniques like sprite cycling, visual tricks, and clever memory management extended the system far beyond its raw specifications. Licensing policies, while controversial, also shaped software quality. Lockout chips and release limits ensured cartridges met Nintendo standards. This said, many of us will remember taking out the cartridge and blowing on it to try and make sure the dust got out, and of course, it would suddenly come to life. In North America, this built trust with retailers and consumers. In Europe, the effect was less pronounced because home computers already had a culture of experimentation and informal distribution. I remember myself playing between golf on my PC at home and then moving over to play on some Duck Hunt on the Nintendo when I wanted to get my eye in a little bit more. The NES library introduced or standardized mechanics still common today: precise platforming, exploration, save systems, and nonlinear progression. Franchises like Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Castlevania, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy began on this hardware. Their early reception and cultural penetration varied regionally, but the titles themselves are massive, and they've made such an impact across all media. In the UK, the NES was successful among younger audiences. I myself was one of those at the time, and households seeking dedicated consoles. It didn't overthrow home computing. It didn't instantly define a generation the way it did in Japan. That context is crucial and often overlooked in simplified histories that we see, especially on YouTube. Understanding NES means seeing both its hardware and software achievements alongside these regional differences. Even today, NES games remain culturally and technically relevant. They're re-released, speedrun, and referenced in modern design. The system is studied for how creative constraints and disciplined licensing policies shaped enduring game design. Its legacy is not one size fits all. You have to look at it in context. Hardware, software, culture, and geography all matter. The Nintendo Entertainment System was successful because it combined predictable, disciplined hardware, quality software, and controlled third-party development. So what do I think of the NES alongside other systems? Personally, it's my number one. The original Nintendo Entertainment System simply sits above all others for me. If we look at the rise of the PlayStation 2, yes, the best-selling game system, I believe, still of history. There's no other that comes close. But the NES, even though here in the UK and Europe, it wasn't the dominance or the replacement that it was in other places, it still had an impact, especially on younger people at the time, such as myself, when it came out. And it lived for a long time in our consciousness as the NES. The SNES didn't even really come into my mind. In the UK and in Europe, the NES still held. And if you want to go and get retro games nowadays, and retro systems, you'll see the NES and games like Duck Hunt put well above, high on shelves with higher price tags than you will any of its children, such as the SNES that came after. The NES for me is number one. Of course, if you go and watch some of my other reviews of retro games, you'll also notice that I put the Game Gear up there as well. So I'm not just a Nintendo guy. Wasn't the biggest fan of the Game Boy, for instance. I'm not specific to the system, but the way that it came across and what it brought with it was so much different. You could play some fun and some technical games on the computer at the time, as well as things like the Amstrad gave you still a little bit more fun. But the NES was where it was. So that's my review. That's my thoughts on the NES. I'd love to hear what you guys think. Anybody out there from different places? Anyone from Japan that knew it as a dominance? Anyone in the US that saw it as this suddenly games are back? And anyone else from Europe like me that saw it and thought, this is changing things. We can live with the Amstrad. We can live with the computers. But this is different. Let me know your thoughts, and thank you so much for sitting down with me for this. A little bit different to my normal stuff, but I have done these before, and I'll do a few of them in the future as well. But I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.